Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet, which is still wrapped in a pandemic. It's hard for some to imagine now, but the vaccine inequity around the world is tremendous, just like energy inequity and climate injustice. And until that gets worked out, we're facing not just this pandemic, but the risk of more pandemics. It's a human-heated planet. As anyone who's been paying attention these last decades or years is aware. It's a fraught planet when it comes to the information environment as well. I'm Andy Revkin at Columbia Climate School. This is sort of two years and change onto the Sustain What webcast that I do, trying to make sense of complex issues that are consequential. And I just saw Rob Willer is in the, there he is too. I'll bring Rob back in here too. Glad you could be here. And today we're going to discuss sort of the intersection of the information storm and the climate crisis through the lens of the recent events. Again, anyone who's been paying attention has seen some young people throw tomato soup on a treasured piece of art under glass in the National Gallery in London. But it's one of many such actions in recent years, and actually going back decades. I was at the climate talks in The Hague in 2000 when Frank Loy, representing the United States, got a pie in the face on the podium. This is not new. What's new is the social media environment around it, which amplifies tremendously the more edgy parts of the conversation. So it's just great to have today a veteran of all this kind of, I call him a performance activist, kind of like a performance artist, who's been an activist for decades on these issues: consumption, climate justice. The Reverend Billy Talen. We have Margaret Klein Salamon, who's the executive director of the Climate Emergency Fund, and who has a background in psychology and has written in depth on her definition of the climate emergency and what people can do to get into sort of a constructive state of emergency. We'll talk about all of that. Dana Fisher, University of Maryland sociologist who studies movements. She studies activism and its discontents and its impacts, and has done this for the Women's March, for the Blue Wave, and also now getting in depth on climate. For a long time, she's worked on climate. And Rob Willer from the a lab, you'll tell me the name of it in a second, at Stanford, who's a sociologist who's dug in on an issue that's resonated in recent days, the idea of the radical flank. In other words, it's easy for us to kind of wag our fingers at people who seem, over the edge of reasonableness, but do they actually create a constructive dynamic that pushes people to into the issue and forward through more moderate means? It's just great to have you all here. Thank you so much. We pulled this together over the weekend. And so, again, I won't show the video again, but here's these young people in London who smeared soup. They had a strong message about both energy poverty, energy cost, and what's going on in the world with climate impacts. And of course, they're operating in an environment that also includes Exxon plastering social media with its propaganda. So it's no surprise that people have to go to great lengths to break through some of those barriers. And of course, then there's just the news barrier, the area that I've worked in for decades, can be challenging. This goes way beyond soup. The Climate Emergency Fund and others have been pouring millions of dollars into the edge. And we're going to hear from Margaret on the strategy, the theory of change. And there's a lot going on even today, all through the month of October. October is a month of action, particularly in Europe, but in the United States as well, and elsewhere, to try to drive their message. As I said, sustained disruptive protests in 11 countries coming this October. And a fellow named Adam Mckay, best known as an amazing filmmaker who's attacked all kinds of targets in his fiction and quasi-fictional satiric dramas and Don't Look Up, has put $4 million of his own money into the Climate Emergency Fund. So here we are. You're all on social media. I hope people out there will follow all of you. And let's just dive in a little bit here. Obviously, first, I think we'll get to this question of what is the goal of the Climate Emergency Fund and its A22 and the groups that you fund, and then we'll get some input from the sociologists. Rob has to leave in about a half hour, so I want to make sure to get him in, and Dana, and then obviously Reverend Billy. I'll leave this for later, but I'd like to get each of you to sort of define when you think about emergency, what is the climate emergency? But I don't want to waste time with that right now. Sorry. Yeah, so I just wanted to get to another slide here. Sorry, here we go. Okay, so Margaret, over to you. How did you go from the dive you did as with your psychological background and your other work to this project, and what's the goal?
Thank you so much. In 2014, I earned my PhD in clinical psychology, but I was so freaked out by the climate emergency that I decided to devote my life to everything I can do to protect humanity in the living world. I started by doing a lot of writing, as well as I started an organization called the Climate Mobilization. Our major tactic that we introduced was the climate emergency declarations that have now gone global. And I came to the Climate Emergency Fund because, I mean, honestly, it wasn't working. I mean, now thousands of governments have declared a climate emergency. That's great. But are they still allowing the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure? Why, yes. So, I think it's really critical when we evaluate any particular action or tactic that we keep the big picture in mind. And in a recent flooding event in Pakistan, 33 million people were displaced by one flooding event. It is impossible to overstate how bad the situation is with the climate. It's horrifying. More than 50% of young people around the world say that humanity is doomed. Okay? The situation is desperate. Normal methods have not worked. And this is the fastest way to create transformative change. That just stop oil. Also, I want to put just stop oil in a little bit more context. Mm-hmm. One criticism I've heard of just stop oil is why target Van Gogh? They should be targeting the oil companies. They have been arrested hundreds of times this year, blocking oil terminals, oil tankers, They have blocked 10 infrastructure sites at the same time, choking off significant amount of fossil fuel supply in whole regions of the United Kingdom. Did you hear about it in the news? Right? They took this action because they are desperate, and they are right to be desperate. And I really don't care about politeness.
But this gets to the goal, though. How do you see this getting to what Dana? I'm going to play a clip in a minute about Dana, her work on the big question: how do you actually transition from attention, including news attention, to change?
Yes. There's a lot of different ways. I'll want to talk about two of them. One is called salience, right? And this has been shown studying the impact of protest on elections, looking at every congressional district and race for the past 30 years and what protests were held in those districts, okay? And the evidence is clear. Protest for liberal causes more vote share for Democrats. Protests for conservative causes more vote share for conservatives. And like I said, the reason is salience. When people go to the polls, they are not asking, should I vote for the climate activists? They're not on the ballot, right? They're asking, how important is climate to my vote? How salient is this? Okay, so that's number one. The best thing that can happen for November is for huge climate protests to break out everywhere, because Democrats are their most trusted issue in terms of their advantage over Republicans is climate. So the climate voters we have, the we're going to be better in November. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is these demonstrations work because they recruit people, which is ultimately what the movement needs to do, right? So I know that the vast majority of people hate the activists and are so angry about this. Okay, but we can still recruit the let's say the visionaries, the people who are done with normal mode. And you know what? Guess what? There's more and more of them every day. So they so it's time to go join the movement. The situation is dire. We have to stop the fossil fuel industry. Let's get in the streets. Let's do this.
Okay. Billy, I think you've been in the streets for decades. So what lessons have you learned that you can apply here? You actually participated in some of the demonstrations that were just being discussed. What's your take on all this? Making a difference, getting it from attention to action, to response.
Well, lately we've been going into one particular Chase Bank. It's the Chase Bank at the Rockefeller Center, and it's beautiful. It's very big, and it has all the races and classes sort of mixed in it, which a lot of the branch banks don't have. And we go in and we have town hall meetings with stacks, and you have to wait in line to talk. And we will have a theme, an issue, a question will be raised by the host figure, and that will be today we're discussing how can we stop the delivery of $5.5 billion from the 20 banks that JP Morgan Chase has gathered to fund the Trans-Canada pipeline that goes through Wet'suwet'en land and Mohawk land. And we have found that if you make your town hall meeting just in the middle of the bank and involve other people, that well, now you're showing a tape that isn't.
That's a different. Yeah, sorry. I realized suddenly this is a wolf howl. So this is the Wolves of Wall Street, but not the town hall meeting.
This is more like a vocal concert on one side of the bank and me preaching in a classic style on the other side of the bank about the Wet'suwet'en. I don't think that.
Well, but maybe that's a good. Let's talk about the difference. The town hall meeting idea sounds.
Well, the town hall meeting, the police march up, and the police immediately start to interrupt it, and a very strong woman says, "No, you're next." You know, the police. We find the police accept that they are in the stack, and three other people have to talk before they get to, and that's because an older woman has scolded them and said, "This is a meeting, please." And so we found that you can transport the cultural habits that are ingrained in us from different kinds of gatherings. You can transport it directly into the Rockefeller Center, JP Morgan Chase Bank. And that they get in line. They haven't yet. Maybe somebody will see this and then they'll say, "Oh, it's all fake. I can bust in there." But we try to move culture into the center of, when we raise the theme in JP Morgan Chase, how do we stop? Do we have to hack the materials? Do we have to stop? Do you stop pixels? How does money move? You know, and we ask that question, and before you know it, you have this middle management person saying, "Well, you can't do that because there's security." Well, what kind of security? Before you know it, you're sort of on the inside in some way. They are on the inside of your activism in some way, and you're having a conversation in which implicit is a common goal. Now, lately at our favorite Chase Bank, the police have not been called. And lately, they have been giving us sneaky little signals of thumbs up and stuff from inside their partitions and so forth. So we're very local. We believe in just the physical presence of the body, and making it into media, of course, for other people to, and that to encourage them to be local too. But of course, the Rockefeller Center, JP Morgan Chase Bank. Chase is from Standard Oil. It comes down, its lineage comes from the original Rockefeller Bank. And we have some Chase people donating money to our theater group. So what was your original question?
Well, just, what do you see as the next step that could translate more? What you were just describing is kind of interesting, because it's kind of an engagement with the quote unquote the devil. You put a hex on the bank once, so having a town hall in which there's some sort of crossover conversation seems different.
Well, we used to be adventurers in religious fundamentalism, and I was a satirical televangelist like Saturday Night Live or something, and we did a lot of casting demons out of sweatshop companies, cash registers and so forth. But now, for the last, since before Occupy Wall Street, we've just been exclusively earth activists.
Right.
And it's not so important to us to try to dismantle the architecture of fundamentalism. The fundamentalism that we're concerned with is gas and oil.
Right. That's a good place to transition to the social scientists here, Rob and Dana. And getting back to the Climate Emergency Fund, that you have a whole website page on the theory of change. And I'll get back to you, Margaret, in a minute on articulating how much of what you're looking for is truly a society-wide emergency form of operating, or this concept of radical flank effect, which seems more strategic. But let's learn about that from a couple of people. Rob, I know you have to leave soon, so maybe, and you've dug in a lot on this question, which has been debated hotly on Twitter in the context of Van Gogh. So what is the radical flank effect, and do we have evidence, and we'll get to Dana, of how it could be employed on the climate challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say that I've moved my later appointment, so I can stay a little bit later.
Oh, good.
Pleasure and an honor to be speaking with all of you today, and speaking with Dana, who's a real, really established scholar in this space. We do a lot of research in my lab, the Polarization and Social Change Lab here at Stanford, on the effects of different protest tactics used under different circumstances on perceptions of movements from observers and third parties. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's definitely one of the things that matters about protest actions is how does the general public or people potentially considering joining a movement, how do they perceive the movement, the righteousness of its cause, how motivated are they to join it, how much do they support the cause that the activists are advocating for. And we find that some activist tactics can put off observers and put off the general public and make them less supportive of a cause and less supportive of a specific set of activists. So in one project that we worked on, that we published a paper called The Activist Dilemma, we talk about the use of extreme protest tactics, and we conducted a series of experiments on how extreme protest tactics affect perceptions of movements. And here we were interested not so much in violent tactics, but in non-violent but highly disruptive tactics. And so there's a pretty large literature on violent tactics. I would say there's pretty consistent evidence that violent tactics put off observers, that observers don't like movements that are associated with violence, and that there are some exceptions where the violence is seen as like critically necessary to effectively advocate for a cause, or perhaps the opponent is seen as already violent or more violent. So there are definitely some exceptions. I mean, we live in a country that worships the leaders of a violent revolution that founded the country. So obviously there are exceptions, and it's important to understand when those apply. But the lion's share of the evidence is that I think that violent protests are less persuasive to the general public than nonviolent protests. But we were interested in below that in terms of levels of extremity. What about disruptive protest that's nonviolent? And what we found consistently in our paper, The Activist Dilemma, is that sort of those sort of protest tactics tend to lead the average observer, really regardless of their political stripe, leads them to identify less with the movement, to support the cause that they're advocating for less, and to report they'd be less likely to join the movement. Now, we also published a paper. Oh, one thing I want to highlight is when we talk about the activist dilemma, what are we talking about? We're talking about something that Margaret's sort of talking about, which is that those same tactics, there's very good reason to also think that you're more likely to get in the news if you use those tactics. You're more likely to be noticed. You're more likely to have whatever you were talking about, actually covered and amplified to many, many people. And so that's the dilemma we were highlighting, is that tactics that are very effective at gaining attention also could have the effect of putting people off on average. We also wanted to study, and then I'll wrap and let other folks talk, but I wanted to just encapsulate a bunch of this research quickly. We also were interested in studying the radical flank effect. And honestly, I was very skeptical of the radical flank effect coming out of our work on the activist dilemma. But the radical flank effect is this idea that an extreme protesters that use extreme or possibly even violent tactics that are within the context of a larger movement, that they make more moderate movement factions look better by contrast. And I think the most commonly cited example is the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s, and the way in which more militant civil rights groups, for example, the Black Panthers, may have made the more moderate civil rights factions look more reasonable by contrast. And this is invoked. I don't think there's a lot of direct evidence for that. I think there is direct evidence that significant policymakers leveraged radical flanks to advance their legislative goals. Like, people like LBJ say, we can get these folks off your back if you side with us. But in any event, so radical flank effects frequently cited. We wanted to see, can we get some causal evidence for them? Because obviously there's radical flanks that have been associated with countless unsuccessful movements and also successful movements. So it's hard to know if they're really helping or if they're hurting or if they're not having any effect at all. Very hard to say. And so we did some experiments where we we either presented people with a radical flank group or a non-radical flank group, and then saw how would that then affect perception of a moderate group, a more moderate protest group that they looked at right afterwards. And we did find this, this hypothesized contrast effect, where if you've looked at this radical group that's using extreme tactics, people didn't like that and were turned off from that group, but then they tended to like the moderate group that they looked at right after that more. So the way we published this was radical flank effects can have this effect. Radical flanks can have this effect on more moderate factions and movements, but we take pains to highlight that we tested it under the most favorable circumstances. You're seeing the radical flank, then right after that, you're judging a moderate group, and you're very clearly seeing their different groups because they have different names and they do different things. And so it's really kind of optimal conditions to get that contrast effect. And I'm personally skeptical that an action like this would trigger that. I think it's more likely that it would either have no effect, which sadly, most stuff has no effect, and it's just sort of you add it all up and you hope to get somewhere, or that it makes the climate movement look unreasonable by being attached to these tactics.
Yeah, and that tweet that I'm showing on screen, you did say this really interesting point about the radical flank effect only works if people are sophisticated, if their view is clear enough that they recognize there's more than one faction in a push. And that seems as an important question to push to Margaret and to Dana. So let's get Dana in on your journey. Dana I did a conversation with her and some other IPCC authors last year, and you basically came to the conclusion we don't know yet. That there's a lot of research to be done on whether activism in all of its varieties is or can slow climate change. Unless I'm missing something.
Well, let me take a step back, Andy.
Okay. Yeah, of course.
So I'll just say, thank you for having me. And this is great to be with all these people, many of whom I've interacted with before, and I think Margaret and I did like a radio show not that long ago. So a lot of my research actually is within the world of social movements, and we social movement scholars don't tend to look at these material outcomes of activism, like the material changes in CO2 emissions and CO2 concentrations. Margaret mentions actually one of the very, very few articles that actually does draw these connections, albeit unfortunately, I think that the data are, don't parse out well enough what exactly is working in terms of the effects at the state level in looking at legislative outcomes. But I think it's really good work. I talk about it in the IPCC. I was tasked with the IPCC, as you know, from that conversation where I went, but basically I was tasked with specifically looking at the climate effects of activism and engagement, so much more broadly thinking about it. And there's not that much we know, which is really unfortunate. And there's so much that we can learn. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important here when we think about the role of, issue salience, how issue salience plays a role in terms of voting behavior. I mean, there is a lot of research that talks specifically about how extreme weather events plays a role in issue salience. And there's this interesting question about the degree to which extreme weather or deviations from normal weather, combined with specific protest tactics, be they more or less confrontational, will play a role in voting behavior. It's a fascinating question. We don't know the answer, but we need to do that kind of research. I mean, the other thing that I think, and I mentioned this to Rob when we were talking on Twitter today, but I mean, I think one of the big questions here is really we need to follow this stuff longitudinally to see how it changes over time. I mean, obviously, we are dealing with a climate crisis, and things are not going to get better, at least not in the short term. So many people are experiencing, and this is what I'm writing about for my new book, the experience of climate shocks is happening around the world, both in Pakistan, but also here in the United States, in every community. And as a result of that, you have a lot more people whom we call in the social movements world sympathizers, who are likely to be mobilized to participate in some form of mass mobilization. Now, the question of whether getting, the media experience of observing this kind of more confrontational activism or a peaceful protest on the street will play more of a role, it's unclear which will be more effective. Again, there's a lot of opportunities to do that kind of research. And that's really the best way for us to know. We can make a lot of claims, and I can tell you a lot about, my research. You had up that table that shows that more and more activists whom I've been surveying over the past, many years, basically have become much more interested and experienced in civil disobedience. So we see a lot more of that. But I mean, I also have been doing research with folks from AmeriCorps and other non-activist segments of the population, and find there again, young people have growing experience with civil disobedience. So a lot of what Margaret's saying, there are a lot of people who are primed for this kind of engagement. And if we look at the data that I posted from Yale from April, it shows that depending on your political orientation or ideology, you'll be more or less likely to sympathize with activists who are engaged in confrontational direct action. So, it's a wonderful opportunity to start thinking about polarization. So it's great that Rob's doing this work. But it also is a place where we have very limited data. We have even more limited analyses, because the kind of research we need to do to really test this out and then see, like the IPC is going to ask me to do probably for AR7, now measure how it has an effect on the actual changes in concentrations of CO2 emissions, which, I still make faces about, because we're a ways off from being able to do that. We could do a lot about following the life cycle of civic engagement, participation, and activism. And there's lots of research that will show from the civil rights movement, but also from more recent protests, that people, and this is, I did also research around the post-George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. There's a lot of data that shows that people will become increasingly confrontational in their activism individually when confronted with suppression and also, challenges to their democratic participation, which we saw, firsthand all over the country during the summer of 2020. I didn't bring up those data when I was talking about this, because we also have all the climate data, but this is very, very consistent across different movements on the left. So I'll stop there, but just to say, I mean, I'd love to be able to measure the carbon effects of activism, but there's so many steps before that. And there's so much to say. The last thing I'll just say is that, I'd spent the summer interviewing activists who are participating in the climate movement for my new book, including a whole range of folks whom I call the climate disruptors, who are the ones who are engaging in civil disobedience. And one of the things that's really clear to me from this is that activists are taking what we call an all of the above thought process with regard to thinking about their tactics, right? We see that all of the above approach to dealing with the climate crisis by extracting all natural resources you can, but also investing in clean energy. Well, we see that with activism too. And I think we should take back that phrase and use it for, in a different way to think about the ways that, this isn't just individuals who basically say, oh, I'm a direct, action person, or I'm a peaceful protest person. These are people who have like a toolbox of different tactics. And I think, Reverend Talen was just saying that basically. You pick the tactic that fits the situation best. So I think that anybody who's trying to bifurcate what's going on in the streets is kind of missing the point.
For sure. And I think that came out once you get away from the sort of the worst part of Twitter, which is the idiot genius kind of bifurcation. There was really a lot of talk about diversity of approaches. One particular that caught my attention was Zaria Howell. Currently, she's kind of criticizing this particular event, saying it was at the level of privilege that misses vulnerability. But in her essay for currently where she works, she closed with the importance of diversity. And I think that is something I've seen over and over again. It's kind of hard for people in the climate movement to embrace diversity, even when they know it's kind of necessary. So, but Margaret, it's time for you, because we've gone through some questions about what works or doesn't. What has led to the confidence level to put the millions of dollars into these particular tactics?
Thank you. So I think it's two things. One is looking at history as well as social science, but looking at historically successful movements. And then the other is looking at the ways that climate is unique, which I really don't think we should undersell. It is the biggest challenge that humanity has ever faced. It threatens everyone individually. There's really not an analog. But first, looking at history, we're in the United Kingdom for this demonstration. Let's look at the suffragettes. Right? They did so much property damage. They smashed up whole streets, and they did that not for clicks, not for, self gratification. They did that because they were demanding the vote. And who wants to look back at that and say, it didn't work, more polite tactics, please, no, you're turning people off. Look for the people decrying this tactic. I think really looking at the movements of history is instructive, but then also climate is unique. As a clinical psychologist, which is my basis for how I come to all of this, my diagnosis is that we are in a mass delusion of normalcy.
Yes.
And that is actually our core problem here, is that the institutions of society, particularly the media, but everything, all the businesses, all the organizations and the libraries and the universities and the museums, they're all just going, putting one step in front of the other, planning for next year, planning for retirement. And so individuals in the same way, they're planning for retirement, they're planning their lives and their futures and their hopes and their dreams as though we weren't walking off a cliff. And it is something that I have seen, something that I've experienced personally, and something that I've seen happen many, many times, that when an individual has an actual reckoning with the truth of the climate emergency, and they allow themselves to feel that emotionally as well as intellectually, they allow themselves to grieve the fact that the future that they thought they had and their cherished hopes and dreams will not happen. Once you get there, then you can get to a place of all in activism where you decide that I'm going to fight for this. I'm going to do everything I can. That's how you get the hunger strikers and these kids that have gone to jail 5 times and they keep coming back. I mean, we're talking about a level of commitment that is so high because it fits the stakes.
Amen.
Thank you, Billy. Thanks.
Um,
Mobilize, hallelujah.
So here, I want to bring in a couple.
Can
of
I ask you a
ideas.
question, please?
Yeah, of course.
Can I ask a question?
Totally. This is a conversation.
You're a very powerful host. You know, we just shut up and wait our turn. I'm interested if Rob considers Margaret a proponent of violence. Rob, you were just flipping around the word violence, and it was covering for a person who's an activist. It's almost meaningless. That's a big spectrum, Rob. That's all the way from euthanasia to shouting Bill McKibben lines in the window. You know, there's no there's property damage. There's property flow damage where you turn off a valve. Then there's the taking an acetylene torch to the metal. Then so there's I see 18 steps there, and you keep saying violence.
No, I didn't mean to keep repeatedly saying violence. I was talking about sub-violent, extreme protest tactics that involve disruption or destruction of property is more the focus of my work. I mean, we have studied violent protest tactics, and others have too. And the overwhelming, finding there is that it tends to make things harder for movements in terms of perception. But there are also exceptions. Happy to speculate with others on the exceptions. But I don't think of this as an example of violence, and I don't think the climate movement's characterized by significant violence as conventionally defined. And I wouldn't think of Margaret as promoting violence unless she said she was.
In its modern form, the Earth First people, the Redwood Summer people, the radical fairies, the people that moved us psychologically, we have a violent society. It's we have an $800 billion Pentagon budget every year. We have a violent society. We have a recent study says that if you live in New York City and you have a computer, that you are subject to 10,000 advertisements a day. So we're not starting from a neutral position. When your fantasy person who is either put off or turned on, they're not a neutral person with a static news news empire over here and another static transportation and energy and food sector over here. They're not standing still. We have the whole question of whether persuasion works. That's what Margaret's talking about. Does persuasion work? Who could be more articulate than Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben? And yet, what have they done? They have energized activists who have energized activists who finally, that fifth layer of activism is where they're risking arrest and they're in the news. The fact is that we have a very narrow society in which we're constantly bombarded by the same ad. And we haven't found a way to counter, as using Kurt Vonnegut's phrase, to counterpunch with that completely prejudicial climate system, psychological climate system coming at us.
Yeah, right. The fact that this is what it takes to get climate into the news. I mean, truly, no one wants to be doing this kind of action. It's risky. They absorb hate. They absorb prison. They're doing it because they're desperate and nothing else has worked. So, and the idea that it's going to turn people off of joining the movement, I don't find that very compelling, particularly because of just the time frames involved. Right? we don't have time to slowly build a successful movement piece by piece. And I am very aware that that is what is considered what you need to win, right? I love the union organizer Jane McAlevey, and she wrote a book called on organizing called No Shortcuts, right? But the fact is, we need shortcuts. We need to find ways to go exponential, right? And that's what Climate Emergency Fund invests in, is organizations that have, and campaigns that have the possibility to create actual breakthroughs, which I would argue this is an example of, but to create actual breakthroughs, not linear progress, because as Bill McKibben says, winning slowly is the same as losing. So it's like, we need a climate movement that's 1,000 times maybe more powerful than what we have today. Like, let's not kid ourselves and think that what we have today has any possible chance of winning. And I also just want to mention that Climate Emergency Fund only supports nonviolent groups and only supports legal activities with our funding. We fund.
Well, this is where I'd like to dig in a little bit. So
Sure.
Hold that thought.
Sure.
In July, I wrote about the DC area disruption here. There was just another one recently. And this is where I'm known as kind of a middle guy, not just because of my journalism, but because of my temperament. And when I saw what unfolded on that highway that day, where a parolee who was trying to get to his job at risk of going back to prison, who has a son, I wrote about it in this way, saying, I took up his cause. He says, open one lane. He said, just open one lane, please, or I'm going to lose, I'm going to violate parole and go to prison. And he ended up arrested with him because he lost his temper. Guess what? And that's a form of violence. So where is the spectrum? And when you say on your website, and you told the New York Times, that people who apply for your grants have to expressly explain how they insulate, how they don't do anything illegal. Everything we're talking about here is illegal. So how do you do that? But let me just play this clip. I think it's worth you hearing. Hopefully, let me turn it.
And you were disrespectful, bro. I'm trying to see my kid grow up and not be in prison. And you were disrespectful towards that. You were Yo, I got one kid. And you were disrespectful to that. I'm asking you for one lane so I can go to fucking work. No. Y'all are recording this. Can you have a seat in your car? I just want one lane. Y'all continue your protest. I'm doing my protest right here for one lane. One lane. Yo, one lane for the people that are disrespectful to y'all world, but y'all are disrespectful to us. One lane. Give us one lane and continue to protest. I promise you, more followers will come.
Anthony mentioned he has an 8-year-old son, and I don't want his son to starve. That is what we're looking at.
It ain't starving, huh? It's development because, they're going to end anyways early because we destroying the world. I understand what you're saying. So give us one lane and let me develop him as much as I can until we did. That's all I'm saying. And y'all are literally disrespectful to us like we are disrespectful to the world.
The only reason I'm doing this.
Now, he said some pretty interesting things there.
Wow.
He ended up losing his temper and getting dragged into a police van, and I still don't know his outcome. They all had to put 4 days, I think, in prison. Was it 1? And they were all complaining about that. They could have ruined this guy's life because they don't have a pressure valve on these things they do. And so, Margaret, is that appropriate?
I think I would support a keep one lane open proposal. That I think makes sense. They do have a policy to allow emergency vehicles to go through.
I've heard about ambulances having to be diverted, so they don't have any reasonable policy for that.
So yeah, I don't have a problem with a one lane open policy.
So just tell us then how you do keep hew to this point you made to the New York Times, where you say, it's hard for me to read the small screen, that entities that apply for that you support training, education, et cetera, grant recipients must confirm that the money that has not been spent, that the money has not been spent on activities prohibited by law. And then here, the Climate Emergency Fund gave close to $1 million to A22.
Right.
Which goes here. So how does that work?
Right. I realize that it seems complicated, but it's actually not. We fund the legal activities that these groups do. They have major recruitment, training, education, and like capacity building programs, right? These are activities that are not only legal, but they are foundational to our democracy, right? Or should we really restrict funding to go out into communities and talk about the scale of the problem and talk about a response that involves civil resistance? I find that very repressive. So yes, do these groups take nonviolent civil resistance? Yes, and we don't fund that. I understand the confusion because we do morally support it, right? We do think that the Van Gogh action, or I do personally anyway, think that the Van Gogh action was a breakthrough. Okay, but we didn't fund it. Yes, we recruited. Like, what is there any link between these things? Yes, but I'm explaining why it's legal. And I mean, one can say, okay, that's not in the spirit of the law. I mean, okay, well, fine. But the fact of the matter is, we are a 501c3 organization that provides funders a safe, legal, tax-deductible way to support radical, direct action movements in their legal activities.
Okay.
I think, Dana, you had your hand up.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt because I mean, this is an important conversation. I just wanted to say, I mean, one of the things that I think would be really valuable, I mean, you know, I'm a social scientist. I am always thinking about the empirical side here, but I mean, and I'm also a social scientist who's been studying, you know, climate activism and activism since COP6, Andy, where I was there, where the protesters came after actually throwing something much more aggressive at Berlusconi in Italy, if you may recall. Anyway, all that being said, this is this wonderful opportunity to actually look at the effect of the tomato toss, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, this action, right? So the action took place in the UK. There are a couple of folks who have posted about having done polls or doing research where they've actually gauged the attitudes towards, by the general public, by registered voters, by others in the UK. There's that study that's going around to this kind of activism. And if you want to see what the effects of this activism are and the degree to which it had issue salience and it mobilized sympathizers, this is the time to do the research to evaluate it. You could do it. So this is a post-test to look at what we already know from data that were collected in April, or data that were collected. I'm trying to think, I wrote down a couple of the dates. So we have the Yale data were from April. I'm not sure when the public opinion survey with YouGov happened. But anyway, this is the time to do it so we could see the effects. Anybody who wants to know how it matters.
With the key question being not what do you think of the activists, but do you think the United Kingdom should continue to issue oil leases for new drilling?
Yes.
Well, no, that actually, Margaret,
I think we should not. And I wonder if anyone on this call or anyone in general the people in general who are critical of the activist tactics, whether they think the United Kingdom should continue.
Well, Margaret, I mean, I think that that's interesting with regard to the broader target of the activism. However, here, the question is really the effectiveness of the activism for what you're talking about, which is salience to the general public or mobilizing sympathizers. And actually, there are ways to measure that, which is not asking people their opinions about the specific goals of the activists, but rather about their positions on the organizations that support direct action and whether or not people are willing to participate in direct action, which are the kinds of questions that I ask in my samples whenever I do this work. So that we have a pre-test, post-test, basically. It'd be an ad hoc, not a real one because we didn't do it ahead of time. But you could easily do that and get at that, as well as ask a question, of course, about the the goals. The goals are much harder, and that's part of the problem. I mean, it's almost as hard to measure, you know, the degree to which people are sympathetic to the goals as it is to look at the actual effectiveness of these kinds of tactics on the actual policy outcomes and emissions. But it could all be done.
I'm showing on the screen another complicating factor. Literally, we live in a world of simultaneous overlapping crises. If you're in a country or if you're a poor person where, like Destiny Knock at Carnegie Mellon recently did a study about how poor people in Pittsburgh wait to, if they have an air conditioner, they wait 4 to 7 degrees hotter before they turn on their air conditioner because they don't have the money for the electricity for the air conditioner. So if you're poor and you can't get through the winter, and the protest is framed around stopping oil and gas, you know, with this crisis unfolding because of Vladimir Putin and other longstanding issues. And of course, we know, you know, the systemic nature of fossil fuels leads to war like what's happening now, but that doesn't matter. Winter is coming. So how do you, I wanted to get quickly from the two researchers, Rob and Dana, how do you study for one effect when you have a 3-dimensional, X-dimensional landscape of things going on? COVID-19 is another. And then we get back to the activists.
I think it's super difficult. I mean, you know, we have this research suggesting that extreme protest tactics that are highly disruptive like this turn off the general public, that's robust across the ideological spectrum. Presumably there's folks that are outside of a movement that are very close to potentially joining it and are very, very like the people engaging in the extreme protest tactics. Presumably they would be more likely to join a movement because they map on to they're almost the people that would have decided to do it themselves. So I think it would be unreasonable for somebody like me to say everybody is turned off by this, because it's very likely there are people just right on the other side of participation that would be turned on and motivated by it and would join and say, that's the kind of tactic that I'd like to do, or that resonates with me.
That sounds so binary. People aren't like that. They're not turned off and turned on like a switch, Rob.
To me, the key issue with what's holding back the movement, because, you know, millions of Americans self-report that they want to take part in civil disobedience on climate. But where is that? So where's show me the demonstrations, right? Where is it happening? And I think the key barrier is helplessness. People feel like they can't have an impact and they don't know where to join. And so I think the galvanizing effect of these protests and organizations, and again, bear in mind, Just Stop Oil has had probably 10 to 15 protests since the Van Gogh soup demonstration, right? That I think it's not as though we have these amazingly successful, robust climate movements all over the world that are like this close to winning, and these activists have come forth and just like ruined everything. It's like, actually, we're up against the most profitable industry in the history of the world, a media landscape that could basically care less. And like, we're trying to start something. This is just the beginning.
Yeah, I think for me, I totally agree with that point about efficacy, that people don't feel like it's clear how to take action that would make a difference on climate. And so you have this paradox in the US where most people report that they believe in climate change and admit that it's a problem, but it's really low on issue salience. It's very low on priority. People aren't going out and doing much of anything about it. They're not voting on the basis of it when they vote for candidates. It lacks political punch. I completely agree. I guess, and I agree that there are not super newsworthy, news generating, issue salience promoting tactics that are available to us that are not this, that are really vividly obvious, And
yes.
So but I would also say that it doesn't necessarily help to make the front page of the paper if it makes you look really bad either. And so that, to me, I see tactics like this and I'm like, well, when we've studied this, tactics as close to this as possible, the evidence is it makes people less likely to join. And so you could make an argument also that Can I complete my thought, Reverend?
That's not the way it works.
I interrupt like
Yeah,
this.
wait.
I didn't interrupt you, and I won't interrupt you. I think that for me, thank you. So I think for me, you could make an argument that if it's a huge high stakes issue, which I completely agree it is, where we need to get as many people involved as possible, that puts a lot of pressure on us to be sure not to take tactical, not to do things tactically that the best evidence suggests will backfire. I mean, you can make just as much of a stakes-based argument to never do something like this.
Yeah, so I want to bring in one other idea here, which relates to what Zaria had written in her critique, Zaria Howlett, currently. It's what's the goal of the activism, or she talked about vulnerability reduction and focusing on justice. No one here has mentioned yet that we live now for the first time in the 35 years I've been on this beat, writing since 1988. There's $500 billion the government has already, a chunk of that's bipartisan money. A chunk of that was the Democratic IRA to make communities more resilient and have clean energy. And Jigar Shah, I did a conversation with the guy who heads the government's energy department's loan program. He's got billions of dollars waiting to give to communities. So where's the activism targeted at those resources that are available now to focus on people who have the most vulnerability, to do that now? This is not all about system change. And I don't see that expressed in here. And again, we live in a diverse array of tactics, but which tactics get the camera?
What
dramatic tactics
what would that
get
look
the camera?
like? What would the activism that you're describing? I mean,
I can play you the clip. Jigar said there's 19,500 communities in America, period. Villages, towns, cities. There's only 4,500 that are bigger than 10,000 people. He said, I want someone at every one of those towns to learn what we have available, to go to your town meeting or go to your school board meeting and hand out sheets on how to do it. And that's something that's just waiting to happen. And that builds momentum and trust and engagement. And it's not an us and them thing. It gets to the roots of the problem.
okay, so it sounds like the government has failed to make the funds accessible, and they need volunteers.
No,
that's
not
right. So
no.
what? I'm just trying to understand the activist role here.
He says literally. Maybe I should play the clip. It's beautifully succinct. And he says, I can't force you to have the money. I can't force you to take the money. Communities have to demand it. And the people, the activists, he says, muckrakers and doers at the local level have to get busy to grab that largesse that's here now. And it's, if you and I don't know a way to express that yet, then that's the communication work that I feel needs to be done very aggressively, because it will not get the spotlight. It will get in 19,500 local newspapers, but it won't get the spotlight.
Wait, can I just add something here? I just want to say, Andy, I just want to say, so I'm actually studying the diffusion of funds through Service Corps that are coordinated through the federal government from the IRA and the bipartisan deal. So I actually know a lot about that, and I'm actually doing it to look at the civic engagement and climate knowledge and participation around the people who are actually serving in those. There are lots of mechanisms in place specifically to do the kind of work that you're talking about here. And I wouldn't want to redirect this conversation away from this type of activism, because
another show.
I mean, yeah, because this is part, again, I mean, like, we're in an all of the above type of engagement moment here around the climate crisis. And every group can't do everything. And so I don't think it's necessarily fair to put people on the line who are engaging in specific tactics around specific types of targets and say, there's lots of work to be done at the local level for sure.
I think I just want to add, and just in terms of who is the Climate Emergency Fund and what do we do? There's not nearly enough philanthropic dollars going to climate in any way, and there's not nearly enough philanthropic dollars going to climate movement building, but there's approximately $0 going to disruptive climate activism. Climate Emergency Fund is one of the very few institutional funders who will support this. So I think that's important to note, is that, you know, these are volunteer powered organizations that scrape by, and they give such high cost effectiveness per dollar, because like I said, they harness this incredible passion and dedication of their volunteer activists. And so, yeah, I want to encourage any potential funders or philanthropists who might be listening to think about these activists as the tip of the spear that really do deserve our support.
Okay, you know, I'm glad, actually, Dana, that was really valuable of you to keep the conversation on the theme of the day. I think it's worth, because of opportunity cost, to really examine, you know, pathways to impact. And, you know, when I've written so much about energy poverty and climate vulnerability, that I see urgent and solvable problems at that scale every day. As Christy Ebbi at University of Washington, the smartest person in the world on climate and heat and health, says nobody needs to die in a heat wave, folks. Nobody, period. She makes the point over and over again. If communities have better heat action plans, and neighbors meet with neighbors and hold Billy style town halls. Billy, you know, there's another kind of town hall to have that actually does harness people, not as a theatrical thing, but in a meaningful way going forward. So I think it's worth injecting that into this conversation to be sure we're all thinking of, you know, outside of our dimensions as we go forward. This has been very stimulating. We could go a little longer if folks can. I know, Rob, you definitely have to get off soon. And I do think there's a chapter 2 or 3 here. These sessions I do always lead to fresh questions, and I just think it's great that you were able to have this conversation. I'm going to just show the website of the Climate Emergency Network one more time. Their approach is in your face, in social media, getting into the media occasionally. To me, one takeaway for sure is maybe putting a little more heft into the obligations for how that money gets spent, so that there's one lane possible where those situations make sense, because lives are being harmed here. And I think there's a way to do this that gets us the edge, gets the views, and also has just a little bit more humanity in it, because that scene haunts me still back in July, and it's not unique. Thanks all for being here today on Columbia Climate School's Sustain What? It's an interrogatory journey toward better impacts around climate, energy, and social issues. Today's show with Margaret Salamon from Climate Resilience Fund, Rob Willer from Stanford, Dana Fisher from University of Maryland. Good luck with your book and the IPCC work. And Billy Talen, my old buddy from the trenches here and around, well, I'm no longer in New York, but around the New York area. I'm Andy Revkin. You can share the show wherever you've been watching it by sharing the link you're on. It stays as the archive video, and send feedback through that little distracting bar at the bottom, which has information on how to reach me. And I appreciate you all being here today. And this is the start of a conversation. Just as Margaret said, this is a long journey ahead. It's hard to think of it that way sometimes because of the urgency, but it's
buckle up.
Buckle up. There you go. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.